The media attention would fade, the viral stories would be replaced by new ones, but something had changed in that small corner of Manhattan. Every person who sat at the counter, whether they knew the full story or not, felt it. The reminder that sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we stop seeing each other as categories or labels and start seeing the human stories that connect us all. And somewhere in his golden tower, a man who had everything learned that the richest experiences often come disguised as moments of humility, and that true leadership begins with the ability to see the world through others' eyes. News of Trump's undercover visit to Jerry's Diner spread through social media like wildfire that evening. At first, it was just a few tweets, blurry photos taken from across the street showing a familiar figure emerging from a car, looking decidedly different. Then came the cell phone videos from passing pedestrians, catching glimpses of what appeared to be Trump removing parts of his disguise as he entered his vehicle. Back at Mar-a-Lago, Trump sat in his study, watching the story unfold on various news channels. Mrs. Chen's excellent makeup work was the subject of much discussion, with some commentators praising the transformation, while others questioned the authenticity of the whole experience. "Sir," Dave said, entering the room with a tablet in hand, "you might want to see this." He handed Trump the device, which showed a social media post from Andy the busboy. There was no mention of Trump or any hint that he knew about the true identity of his homeless customer. Instead, the post simply read, "Sometimes angels come disguised as those who need our help the most. Today reminded me why I love working at this diner. Every person has dignity, every story matters." The post had gone viral, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of unexpected kindness and hidden blessings. The comments section was filled with similar tales from diners, restaurants, and small businesses across the country. Mr. Lee's phone hadn't stopped ringing all day. News vans parked outside the diner hoped to get a statement, but he simply posted a sign, "No interviews, just good food and good people welcome here." The regular customers formed a protective barrier, taking their usual seats and carrying on their normal routines despite the media circus outside. The construction worker who had paid for Trump's coffee was interviewed by a persistent reporter as he left work. His response became another viral moment, "Look, I didn't know it was him. And it wouldn't have mattered if I did. In this city, we look out for each other. That's just what New Yorkers do." Pat's shift had ended hours ago, but she stayed to help manage the sudden influx of curious customers. When asked about serving the disguised Trump, she shrugged and said, "Every person who sits at my counter gets the same treatment. That's what makes this place special." The elderly woman with the newspaper returned for her usual afternoon tea. Rather than talk about Trump, she shared stories about her late husband, how he'd worked 3 jobs during hard times, how he'd always helped others even when they were struggling themselves. "That's what I saw in that man's eyes today," she told another regular customer. "Someone learning what really matters." Trump's phone buzzed with messages from political advisors, all eager to capitalize on the story. Instead of responding, he found himself reading through the comments on Andy's post. People from all walks of life were sharing their experiences of unexpected kindness, of moments when they'd been humbled, of times when they'd learned to see beyond surface appearances. A homeless shelter downtown reported a surge in donations, with many contributors citing the diner story as their inspiration. Local businesses began offering pay-it-forward programs, allowing customers to prepay for meals that anyone could claim. The simple act of human kindness had sparked a movement. Late that night, Mr. Lee finally had a moment to sit in his quiet diner. The media trucks had mostly left, but the real story wasn't about Trump's visit. It was about the everyday magic that happened in places like this, where people from all walks of life came together, shared their stories, and helped each other through tough times. The promised wire transfer had arrived, but Mr. Lee decided to keep the diner exactly as it was. The money would go to helping his extended family of customers, college funds, medical bills, roof repairs, and other quiet acts of support. No announcements, no publicity, just help where it was needed most. Trump sat in his study, still in his regular clothes, but feeling forever changed by his morning as Tom. The experience had stripped away the layers of privilege and power, leaving him with a profound understanding of the real struggles and triumphs of everyday people. He picked up his phone one last time that night, not to check the news or his messages, but to send a simple text to Mr. Lee. Thank you for showing me what real wealth looks like. The next morning, I know, Mr. Lee replied simply. Returning to his seat at the counter, Trump felt lighter somehow. The weight of his usual responsibilities, his public persona, the constant scrutiny, it all seemed less important now. He watched as Andy collected another tip, as Pat poured another cup of coffee, as the elderly woman with the newspaper gathered her things to leave. The construction workers were putting on their hard hats, preparing to return to their job site. The young office workers were checking their phones, reluctantly heading back to their cubicles. Each person carried their own story, their own struggles, their own dreams. Dave appeared at his elbow, right on schedule. Time to go, he murmured quietly. Trump nodded, standing slowly, maintaining his character. He left enough money on the counter to cover his meal and a generous tip, adding a folded note that simply read, "Thank you for the kindness you show to strangers." As he shuffled toward the door, the bell chiming one last time, he caught a glimpse of Mr. Lai watching from behind the counter. Their eyes met briefly, sharing a moment of understanding that transcended all the usual barriers of wealth, status, and politics. Outside, the morning sun had risen fully, painting the city in a different light. Trump knew that tomorrow he would return to his world of towers and televised speeches. But something had changed, not just in how he saw others, but in how he saw himself. The morning rush was starting to thin out when Trump excused himself to use the restroom. His heart was pounding, not from fear or anxiety, but from the weight of everything he'd witnessed. The small bathroom at the back of the diner was clean but worn, its dated tiles and flickering fluorescent light telling their own story of a place that got by on care rather than luxury. Standing before the scratched mirror, he studied his transformed reflection. Mrs. Chen's makeup work had held up perfectly, but something else had changed in his face, something deeper than the theatrical alterations. The eyes looking back at him held a new understanding, perhaps even a hint of humility. After checking that he was alone, Trump pulled out his phone, not the basic burner phone that was part of his disguise, but his regular one, carefully hidden in an inside pocket. With slightly trembling fingers, he sent a brief message to his financial advisor. Need immediate wire transfer to Diner's account. Will explain later. Urgent. The response came quickly. Amount. Trump thought for a moment, then typed, enough to cover every customer's meal for a year. He paused, then added, and a college fund. Details to follow. Walking back to the main dining area, he caught sight of Andy diligently cleaning tables, tucking tips into his pocket with careful appreciation. The construction workers were settling their bills, leaving generous tips despite their own financial pressures. Pat was refreshing coffee cups, but tired feet carrying her through another hour of her shift. Trump approached the counter where the owner, Mr. Lai, was going through receipts. "Excuse me," he said softly, still in character. "Could I speak with you privately? It's important." Mr. Lai looked up, initially wary. He'd owned the diner for 30 years, had seen every type of customer, every possible situation. "Is there a problem with your meal?" he asked cautiously. "No, no problem," Trump assured him. "Please, just 2 minutes of your time." Something in his tone must have convinced Mr. Lai, who nodded and led the way to a small office behind the kitchen. The space was tiny but organized, with decades of receipts filed neatly in worn folders. A family photo on the desk showed 3 generations of smiling faces. Once the door was closed, Trump carefully peeled back the edge of his prosthetic makeup. Mr. Lee's eyes widened in recognition, but before he could speak, Trump held up a hand. "Please," he said in his natural voice, "I need this to stay between us for now." He glanced at the family photo. "How long have you owned this place?" 32 years, Mr. Lee replied, still staring in disbelief. "My father started it. We've seen good times and bad." Trump nodded, thinking of all the conversations he overheard that morning. "Your customers, they're like family to you, aren't they?" "They are family," Mr. Lai corrected him gently. "Every single one. Even the ones who can barely afford a cup of coffee, especially them." Trump pulled out his phone again, showing Mr. Lai the message exchange with his financial advisor. "I want to help, but quietly. No publicity, no announcements. Just help." Mr. Lai sat heavily in his chair, studying Trump's face. "Why?" "Because I'll earn more in 2 hours at your counter than in 20 years of board meetings," Trump replied honestly. Your busboy Andy. He deserves that college fund. Pat deserves a raise. Those construction workers deserve to buy lunch without counting every penny. Tears welled up in Mr. Lee's eyes. You know, you used to come here years ago. Always ordered the same thing. Always tipped well. But this, he gestured at Trump's disguise, this is different. I'm different, Trump said simply. One morning of being invisible opened my eyes to things I never saw from the penthouse. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, writing a private number on the back. My team will contact you today to arrange everything. But remember, this stays between us. Mr. Lai stood and extended his hand. Thank you, he said, then added with a slight smile, would you like some pie before you go? On the house. Trump chuckled, slipping back into his disguise persona. Better not. Got to stay in character. He paused at the office door. Mr. Lai, thank you for maintaining this place. It's more than just a diner. The elderly woman with the newspaper had been watching Trump throughout his meal. Finally, she spoke directly to him. You remind me of my late husband, she said quietly. He never gave up either, no matter how hard things got. The comment hit him harder than any political attack ever had. This stranger had seen humanity in him when he was trying his hardest to be invisible. As the morning wore on, Trump found himself struck by the complex web of relationships and mutual support that existed in this simple diner. People who might disagree completely on politics or policy were still helping each other in small ways, sharing newspapers, offering advice about cheap grocery stores, passing along job tips. The world he usually inhabited, of gold-plated everything and powder room deals, seemed increasingly distant. Here, in this small corner of Manhattan, he was witnessing a different kind of wealth, the richness of human connection, the dignity of work, the quiet strength it takes to keep going when the odds seem stacked against you. Dave caught his eye again from his position at a nearby table, tapping his watch discreetly. Their time was running short, but Trump felt oddly reluctant to leave. He had come here expecting to observe, to gather information perhaps, but instead found himself being transformed by what he was witnessing, not just hearing stories, but feeling the weight of them, understanding them in a way that all his years of business and politics had never prepared him for. As Trump worked on his meal, the diner buzzed with the kind of honest conversations that only happen when people think no one important is listening. The construction worker who had paid for his coffee was now deep in conversation with his buddy about the challenges they faced on their latest project. I'm telling you, Bob, the first worker said, wiping his mouth with a paper napkin, everything costs triple what it did 2 years ago. My crew can barely afford to eat lunch these days. He gestured with his fork to emphasize his point. And don't even get me started on trying to buy a home. My kid's giving up on that dream entirely. His friend nodded in agreement. Yeah, my sister just had to move back in with our parents. She's got a college degree and everything, but her rent went up so much she couldn't hack it anymore. He stirred his coffee thoughtfully. Something's got to give, you know? Trump found himself leaning slightly closer, absorbing every word. These weren't the carefully crafted speeches he was used to hearing, but raw, unfiltered reality. Each story carried the weight of genuine experience, not poll-tested talking points. At a nearby table, an elderly woman with carefully styled silver hair was reading the morning paper. Well, I'll tell you one thing, she announced to no one in particular, at least some of those tax cuts helped my retirement account. Course, with prices these days, it's still not enough. She folded her paper precisely, smoothing the creases with practiced hands. A younger woman sitting nearby looked up from her phone. Must be nice to have a retirement account, she said, but without malice. I'm 35 and still paying off student loans. Can't even think about saving for retirement. The elderly woman's face softened. It wasn't always like this, dear. When I started working, you could support a family on one income. Had benefits too, medical, dental, the works. She shook her head slowly. World's changed so much. Andy the busboy passed by again, clearing plates with quiet efficiency. Trump noticed how he seemed to have a kind word for everyone. A gentle, how's your mom doing? To one regular, I hope your interview went well yesterday to another. He was building his own small community within these walls, one small interaction at a time. The cook called out another order, his voice carrying over the general chatter. 1 meatloaf special, extra gravy. The familiar rhythm of the diner continued, but Trump was now hearing it differently. Each order represented someone's careful budgeting, their small indulgences, their daily struggles. A group of office workers at a corner booth caught his attention. They were having an animated discussion about their workplace. "I'm just saying," one young man said, straightening his slightly wrinkled tie, "the CEO gets another bonus while they cut our health benefits. Make it make sense." His colleague, a woman in a sensible business suit, sighed, "My kid needs braces, but with the new insurance plan, I can't afford it." Meanwhile, they're renovating the executive floor again. She stabbed at her salad with frustrated energy. Trump felt each word like a physical impact. He'd been on the other side of such decisions countless times, seen only numbers on spreadsheets, not the human stories behind them. Now, those spreadsheet numbers had faces, had lives, had dreams they were struggling to keep alive. Pat passed by with fresh coffee, topping up cups with the automatic grace of long practice. She paused briefly at Trump's spot. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, her initial wariness replaced by professional courtesy. The simple question carried an undercurrent of dignity. She was treating him like any other customer now. "The food was very good," Trump replied softly, still practicing his rougher voice. "Thank you." A businessman in an expensive suit entered the diner, phone pressed to his ear, talking loudly about market projections and quarterly reports. Trump watched as the other diners subtly adjusted their positions, creating invisible barriers between themselves and this intrusion from another world. His world, he realized with a start. The construction worker who'd paid for his coffee earlier spoke up again, this time to Andy. "Hey kid, how's that college fund coming along?" The question carried genuine interest, suggesting this was an ongoing conversation. Andy's face brightened. "Almost halfway there, Mr. Chen. Been picking up extra shifts whenever I can." His pride in this achievement was palpable, and Trump found himself wondering how many extra hours of work, how many missed moments with family, that prideful smile represented. As he cut into his steak, Trump was acutely aware of how this simple meal, something he'd ordered countless times without a second thought, represented a significant expense for many of the people around him. The construction worker's casual generosity, Andy's college fund tips, Pat's extra fries. Each was a small thread in a larger tapestry of human dignity and kindness he was only now seeing clearly. The newspaper reader from earlier had been watching everything over the edge of his paper. He folded it carefully and turned to Trump. "Times are tough all over," he said quietly. "But sometimes it's the tough times that show us who we really are." He dropped a tip on the counter and left, his words hanging in the air like a prophecy. Trump ate slowly, savoring each bite, listening to the life stories playing out around him. The diner had returned to its normal rhythm, but something had shifted. He was no longer just an observer in this small drama of everyday life. He had become part of it, had felt its struggles and its kindnesses firsthand. Dave, disguised as a businessman at a nearby table, caught his eye briefly. The message was clear. They'd been here long enough. But Trump wasn't quite ready to leave. For the first time in years, he felt connected to something real, something that no amount of wealth or power could buy. The simple human dignity of being treated as just another person trying to make it through another day. After nursing his coffee for nearly half an hour, Trump's stomach reminded him it was time to order something more substantial. He'd been watching other customers, noting what seemed to be popular choices, trying to blend in with the regular crowd. The familiar aroma of grilled onions and sizzling beef from the kitchen was making his mouth water. Pat approached with the coffee pot, offering a refill. "Ready to order, hon?" she asked, her voice carrying the gentle wariness of someone halfway through their shift. Trump noticed how she kept a careful distance, not unkind, but cautious. It was a stance he'd seen countless times from behind his desk, but never from this side of the counter. "Yes," he said softly, then cleared his throat. "Could I have the steak and eggs?" The words came out before he could stop himself, his regular order from years ago, when he'd been a different person sitting on these same stools. Pat's expression shifted slightly. She glanced at his worn clothes, then back at his face. "That's $18, she said carefully. "We need to see payment up front for certain orders." The words weren't cruel, just matter of fact, but they hit Trump with unexpected force. The diner had grown quieter. A few nearby customers were trying not to stare while obviously listening to every word. Trump felt heat rise in his cheeks, a strange sensation for someone who'd handled much more dramatic confrontations in his life. I have money," he mumbled, reaching into his jacket pocket. The thick wallet he usually carried had been replaced with a few crumpled bills for authenticity. As he pulled them out, one fell to the floor. A young busboy who had been cleaning nearby quickly picked it up and handed it back to him. "Here you go, sir," the busboy said quietly. His name tag read Andy, and his kind eyes reminded Trump of his own grandson. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, yet there was an old soul's wisdom in his gentle gesture. Trump's hands trembled slightly as he counted out the bills, not part of his act, but a genuine reaction to this unfamiliar situation. The money he had was enough, but just barely. He laid it on the counter, and Pat counted it twice before nodding. "How would you like your steak?" she asked, her voice slightly softer now. "Well done, please," Trump replied, then added hastily, "if that's not too much trouble." A construction worker at the end of the counter had been watching the scene unfold. He cleared his throat and spoke up. "Hey, Pat, add his coffee to my bill." He nodded at Trump, then went back to his own breakfast without waiting for thanks. The gesture caught Trump off guard. In his regular life, he was always the one picking up checks, making grand gestures. Being on the receiving end of such simple kindness felt different. It carried a weight he hadn't expected. Andy the busboy lingered nearby, organizing clean silverware. "The steak here is really good," he said conversationally, clearly trying to ease the tension. "My mom works nights cleaning offices, and sometimes when she picks me up after my shift, we split one." He smiled, a genuine, warm expression that seemed to brighten the whole counter. Trump noticed how the boy's shoes were carefully cleaned but worn at the edges, how his uniform had been pressed with obvious care. Here was someone who took pride in their work, no matter how humble the task. "Your mom must be proud of you," Trump said softly, meaning it. Andy's face lit up. "She is. I'm saving up for community college. Every tip helps." He went back to his tasks, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned the value of hard work early in life. The incident had sparked various conversations around the diner. Trump caught fragments of discussions about rising costs, minimum wage, and the challenges of city living. A retired teacher in the corner booth was telling anyone who'd listen about the increasing number of her former students who were struggling to make ends meet. Pat returned with his order, setting it down with professional precision. The steak was smaller than he remembered from his previous visits, but the smell was exactly the same. She'd added extra fries to his plate, a small kindness that spoke volumes. "Thank you," Trump said, his voice rougher than usual, and not just because of his character. "Enjoy your meal," Pat replied, and he caught the faintest smile as she turned away to help other customers. The newspaper reader beside him folded his paper with a sigh. "World's going crazy," he muttered to no one in particular. Trump noticed his hands, worn wedding ring, carefully manicured nails despite the shabby suit. Someone holding on to pride while fighting harder times. Through the window, he could see one of Dave's security team members casually leaning against a newspaper stand, maintaining their discreet watch. Inside, the other undercover officers blended perfectly with the morning crowd. One appeared to be dozing in a corner booth, another typed away on a laptop like any other early morning worker. The menu sat before him, laminated and slightly worn at the edges. The prices had gone up since his last visit, but not as much as he would have expected. His stomach growled as he remembered the steaks he used to order here, always well done, always with a side of crispy fries. But Tom wouldn't order steak for breakfast. He studied the cheaper options, feeling a new appreciation for how people make these small but significant decisions every day. The math of measuring hunger against limited resources was something he'd never had to consider before. A fresh wave of customers pushed through the door, bringing with them a burst of cold air and city noise. The diner was filling up now, the morning rush beginning in earnest. Trump sank deeper into his character, shoulders hunched over his coffee cup, invisible in plain sight among the swirl of Manhattan's morning ritual. As he sat there, absorbing the scene around him, he realized this wasn't just about seeing the diner from a different perspective. It was about understanding a world that had always existed parallel to his own, A world where people didn't make headlines or close million-dollar deals, but instead found their own kind of wealth in small moments, warm coffee cups, and quiet dignity. The early morning streets of Manhattan felt different at ground level. Trump shuffled along the sidewalk, keeping his head down just as he'd practiced. The familiar city he'd known for decades suddenly seemed alien from this new perspective. People rushed past him, some deliberately stepping aside, others barely acknowledging his existence. It was a strange feeling for someone who usually commanded every room he entered. The walk to Jerry's Diner took longer than usual, partly because of his slower pace, but mainly because he had to fight the urge to look up at his buildings along the way. Every few steps, he had to remind himself to stay in character. "You're Tom," he whispered to himself, just another forgotten face in the crowd. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of coffee and fresh bread from nearby bakeries. Street vendors were setting up their carts, the clatter of metal poles and hiss of heating grills adding to the city's awakening symphony. A few times, Trump caught his reflection in store windows. The transformation still startled him. As he approached Jerry's Diner, his heart began to race. The familiar red and chrome exterior hadn't changed much since his last visit years ago. Through the large windows, he could see the morning regulars already settled in their usual spots. The neon "Open" sign buzzed quietly, a beacon in the early morning light. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door. The little bell above chimed just as he remembered, but this time nobody looked up to see who was entering. The warmth of the diner wrapped around him, carrying the comforting smell of coffee, bacon, and griddle grease. An older man in a worn business suit sat at the counter, mechanically stirring his coffee while reading the morning paper. A couple of construction workers occupied a booth near the back, their yellow hard hats placed carefully on the seats beside them. At another table, a young woman in scrubs dozed over what looked like a post-night shift meal. Trump shuffled toward the counter, choosing a spot between the newspaper reader and an empty seat. The worn vinyl cushion squeaked under his weight as he settled onto the stool. The counter was slightly sticky from countless cups of coffee and quick wipes with a damp cloth. The newspaper reader briefly glanced his way, then returned to his morning routine, shifting slightly to create more space between them. Trump felt a twinge in his chest. He'd seen that same movement countless times from the other side, watching people distance themselves from those they'd rather not acknowledge. A waitress approached, her name tag reading Pat. She had laugh lines around her eyes and moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd been serving customers for decades. "Coffee?" she asked, already reaching for a mug, her voice carrying the slight raspiness of long hours and too many conversations. "Please," Trump replied softly, remembering to use his practiced rougher voice. He cupped his hands around the warm mug when she filled it, just as he'd seen countless others do, not just for the warmth of the coffee, but for the comfort of holding something steady. The diner's routine flowed around him. The cook called out orders in a rhythm that hadn't changed in years. "Order up. 2 sunny, home fries, crispy." The scrape of plates, the clink of cutlery, and the murmur of early morning conversations created a familiar symphony he'd never truly noticed before. From his seat, Trump could observe everything while remaining virtually invisible. The construction workers discussed their upcoming project, comparing notes about materials and deadlines. The woman in scrubs finally gave up on her meal and left some crumpled bills on the table before heading out, likely toward home and some well-deserved rest. A group of office workers came in, their fresh suits and eager energy marking the start of their day. They clustered around a table, already deep in conversation about meetings and deadlines. Trump watched as Pat smoothly managed their rapid-fire coffee orders without missing a beat. Trump practiced his new persona, working on making his distinctive voice sound rougher, more weathered. They'd spent hours the night before developing this character's backstory, making sure he could answer basic questions without hesitation if anyone tried to strike up a conversation. As the sun finally began to rise, casting long shadows through the windows, the team made their final preparations. Dave went over the security plan one last time. 2 plainclothes officers would be in the diner, pose as regular customers, and another 3 would be stationed outside in unmarked cars. Mrs. Chen packed up her equipment, giving Trump one last critical look. "Remember," she said, "don't touch your face, try not to sweat too much, and if you need to wipe your face, dab, don't rub." She handed him a small kit with touch-up supplies just in case. Standing there in his completely transformed state, Trump felt a strange mix of vulnerability and liberation. For the first time in decades, he would walk down a New York street without turning heads, without cameras flashing, without people pointing and whispering. He was about to experience life from an entirely different perspective, and despite all his years in the spotlight, he felt genuine butterflies in his stomach. "Ready?" Dave asked, checking his watch one final time. Trump took a deep breath, settling into his new character. "Ready," he replied in his practiced, rougher voice. As they prepared to leave, he caught one final glimpse of himself in the mirror. The man looking back at him wasn't Donald Trump, business mogul and former president. He was just another face in the crowd, invisible to the world he was about to step into. The next morning arrived with a mix of excitement and nervous energy. In a secluded room at Mar-a-Lago, away from the usual hustle and bustle, Trump sat in front of a large mirror. The morning sun hadn't yet peeked over the horizon when Mrs. Chen, his trusted makeup artist from his television days, arrived with several large cases of equipment. "This is going to take time," she said softly, studying his face with professional concentration, "and you'll need to be patient." Trump nodded, unusually quiet as he watched her unpack her tools. After 30 years in the industry, Mrs. Chen had transformed countless faces, but this would be her most challenging assignment yet. She started by applying a special adhesive to his hairline. "This will help create a different facial structure," she explained, carefully adding layers of prosthetic material. Trump winced slightly at the cold sensation but remained still. Years of television experience had taught him the importance of letting makeup artists work their magic uninterrupted. Dave stood guard at the door, occasionally checking his watch. They had timed this operation carefully, the early morning hours when most of the staff was either ending their night shift or hadn't started their morning one. The fewer people who knew about this, the better. As Mrs. Chen worked, she shared stories from her decades in the industry, keeping Trump distracted from the discomfort of the transformation. "You know," she said, carefully blending colors on her palette, "I once made a young actor look so different that his own mother walked past him on set." She chuckled softly, her skilled hands never pausing in their work. The transformation progressed methodically. First came the base layers that would change the very structure of his face, subtle additions to his nose, cheeks, and chin. Then came the detailed work of creating texture, adding years of weathering and hardship to his skin. Mrs. Chen worked with the precision of an artist, each brush stroke deliberate and purposeful. "The key," she explained while working on his hands, "is not just changing how you look, but helping you become a different person entirely." She applied special makeup that made his hands appear rougher, with slight tremors, the hands of someone who'd spent years on the streets. Trump watched in fascination as his reflection became increasingly unrecognizable. His signature hairstyle disappeared under a masterfully crafted wig of gray and white, thinning in places, unkempt but not overdone. Mrs. Chen had brought several options, finally selecting one that looked naturally weathered by time and elements. The clothing transformation came next. Dave had arranged for a collection of second-hand clothes, carefully selected to look worn but not theatrical. "These have been properly cleaned and treated," he assured Trump, who nodded appreciatively. They chose layers: a thin t-shirt, a flannel shirt with frayed edges, and a heavy jacket that had seen better days. "Remember," Dave coached as Trump practiced moving in his new outfit, "you're not just wearing a costume. You need to become this person, someone who's used to being invisible, who moves differently, speaks differently." Trump practiced walking with a slight shuffle, shoulders hunched, head down, the opposite of his usual confident stride. It felt strange, like learning to walk all over again. "How do I look?" he asked, his voice deliberately rougher, quieter. Mrs. Chen stepped back, studying her work critically. "The real test," she said, "will be if you can fool someone who sees you up close. The makeup will hold, but you need to maintain the character." She made a few final touches, adding supple shadows under his eyes and around his mouth. They had brought in a full-length mirror, and Trump stood before it, barely recognizing himself. The man staring back at him looked at least 15 years older, worn down by life but not beaten. His normally commanding presence had been replaced by something more subtle, almost invisible. "The key is in the details," Dave reminded him, adjusting the jacket's collar. "Remember our background story? You're Tom. You've been on the streets for 3 years after losing your job and home. You keep to yourself, don't make too much eye contact, and speak softly." The warm Florida breeze swept through Mar-a-Lago's ornate hallways as Donald Trump paced back and forth in his private study. The golden rays of sunset painted the room in amber hues, but his mind was elsewhere. The constant swirl of news headlines, social media storms, and political battles had left him feeling oddly empty. Something was missing. A connection to the real world that had slowly slipped away over the years. Picking up his phone, he scrolled through another batch of news articles about himself. "They don't know me," he muttered, tossing the phone onto his leather chair. "They don't know what I really think, what I feel." His eyes wandered to the television screen where a news anchor was discussing the growing divide between America's elite and everyday citizens. That's when it hit him, an idea so outrageous yet so simple it might just work. He hadn't done anything spontaneous in years, not since becoming a politician. Every move, every word was calculated, planned, and analyzed. But right now, he yearned for something real. "Get me Dave from security," he called out to his assistant. Within minutes, Dave, his most trusted security officer of 15 years, appeared at the door. The look on Trump's face made Dave nervous. He knew that expression all too well. It usually meant something unexpected was about to happen. "Dave, remember Jerry's Diner in Manhattan?" Trump asked, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. "Used to have the best steak and fries in the city. Been thinking about it lately." Dave nodded cautiously. "Yes, sir. You used to go there quite often before." Before everything changed, Trump finished the sentence. Before every restaurant visit became a media circus. Before every bite I took turned into a headline. He walked to his window, looking out at the manicured gardens below. "I want to go back there, Dave, but not as Donald Trump, former president. I want to go as nobody." Dave's eyes widened as he realized what Trump was suggesting. "Sir, with all due respect, that's extremely risky. The logistics alone would be." "That's why I need your help," Trump interrupted, turning back to face him. "We can do this. Small team, total secrecy. I need to see how people really live, how they really talk when they don't know I'm in the room. No cameras, no reporters, no tweets. Just real people having real conversations." As Dave listened to Trump's plan, his professional concern battled with understanding. He saw something in his boss's eyes he hadn't seen in a long time, a genuine desire to step out of his golden tower and experience life from a different angle. "What exactly are you thinking, sir?" Dave asked, already knowing he'd probably regret this conversation. Trump's face lit up with enthusiasm. "A complete transformation. Make me unrecognizable. Someone nobody would look twice at, maybe a homeless person. They're invisible to most people, aren't they? Perfect cover." He was getting excited now, the idea taking fuller shape in his mind. Dave started pacing, his mind racing through security protocols and potential scenarios. "Sir, this is unprecedented. The risks involved." "Life is all about risks, Dave," Trump said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of determination. "But this time, it's not about business deals or politics, it's about understanding. When was the last time I had a real conversation with someone who wasn't trying to either please me or attack me?" The room fell silent as Dave considered the implications. He knew trying to talk Trump out of it would be futile. Once he set his mind to something, there was no turning back. The best he could do was ensure it happened as safely as possible. "If we do this," Dave said slowly, emphasizing each word, "we need to plan it perfectly. And we need someone who can do professional-grade makeup and disguise work, someone we can trust completely." Trump nodded eagerly, already reaching for his phone. "I know just the person. Remember that makeup artist from The Apprentice? The one who always made me look natural on camera. Let's get her." As the night deepened and plans were made in hushed tones, Trump felt a spark of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow, he would step out of his world of luxury and step into someone else's shoes, someone whose life couldn't be more different from his own. Little did he know, this impulsive decision would lead to one of the most eye-opening experiences of his life, challenging his perspectives and touching his heart in ways he never expected. As he finally retired to bed that night, his mind raced with possibilities. For the first time in years, he felt like he was about to do something truly meaningful, something that wasn't about politics, power, or public image, but about rediscovering the human connections he'd lost along his journey to the top.